Anthropologists have always been interested in the ways in which people reproduce and don't reproduce and have sex with each other, and have documented about every range of sexual practice that you could think of and more. Oftentimes, these, as they note in the textbook, these documentations were more about the weird ideas that Victorian era British anthropologists had in their hang-ups about sexuality than they might have been about the people themselves. But it leads us to the only consistent observation, the only thing that seems to be true if you look around societies around the world and through time, is that there seems to be something of an incest taboo, which is to say, you are not supposed to mate with people who are too close to you, biologically speaking. However, even that is variable from society to society, and in certain ruling classes, such as the Inca perhaps, or the Egyptian pharaohs, by breaking the incest taboo, you would prove that you are divine. We find this in a lot of different societies, but it varies how close you would consider your relatives to be. And even in our own society, people break this taboo, often in terrible and sad ways. I would say that whenever we are talking about one of these things, all the things that we're talking about, gender, sexuality, whether you treat nurses or doctors or different professors differently based on their gender, we are talking about general observations. There's always going to be individual variability in any society. We'll talk in the next section about health and religious rituals and practices around dying. There's always going to be somebody who doesn't participate in the ritual, who doesn't believe it. Not everybody in a religion believes this equally. And we know this as we look around our own society. We can see that there is variation within any society, but we want to know, or we want to be careful when we look at other societies to know that they are also not robots following the norms or the guidelines or the laws of their society. People are, people do different things all the time. There are many societies, both in the past and in the present, who would think of acts that we carry out, or who don't think it is unusual for people to engage in acts or practices that we would consider to be homosexual. So certainly there has to be a lot of heterosexual sex in the world, but there's also a lot of homosexual sex in the world. And there are a lot of people who don't think that's weird, both in the past and in the present. However, well, I'm going to say however a lot today. We have to be careful. That doesn't mean that the identities that we have and that we consider people to be as either gay or straight can simply be projected onto different societies in the past or the present. So there are people who might engage in both heterosexual and homosexual sex, and they would not identify as gay or as straight because those identities are fairly recent ones. The idea that people have to be one or the other. And it goes with what we were talking in some ways about gender. There's this idea that we have that you have to be one or the other, and you have to check off certain boxes, and you have to identify as that. And in plenty of places around the world, there may be a range of sexual practices, but that doesn't mean you take that on as an identity or a cultural role. Now, we were talking about ideas of homosexuality in past societies, and every so often, you dig up something like this, and you're like, whoa, hey now, that's interesting. Now, we have to be very careful when we are interpreting stuff we dig up without written records. This does not necessarily mean that people loved pornography or that they necessarily were identifying as homosexuals. In this case, at least according to some archaeologists or some interpretations, this may not even be a representation of a sexual act. Now, I have to say, it looks sexual to me, but these items have been found, or where they were found, were in high status tombs. What they seem to indicate, or they could just as well indicate, is a transmission of power from one generation to the next. So we know that in different societies, people consider certain fluids, or we talk about blood, for example, as being something that is transmissible. We now talk about it as genes, but we used to talk about it as being in our blood. Sometimes we think of these fluids as themselves the source of that power. And it is possible that this is a representation more of power status than it is of a sexual activity. Again, we just want to be careful here. If you don't have people talking about what they think it is, there's a lot of human variation. Now, it probably does, in some sense, mean that they were familiar with a wide range of sexual practices. Another case in which we have to be careful is the discovery of these two skeletons entwined in an embrace found in Modena, Italy. The archaeologists originally assumed that this was a man and a woman. They were dubbed the Lovers of Modena. Later genetic testing reveals that they were both male. Does this mean they were the male lovers of Modena? Who knows? Hard to say. But the point of the matter is, we find people of various genders and sexualities throughout history. We just want to be careful we don't make assumptions about them based on our own ideas. Because many of our own assumptions are going to be based on something that your textbook calls heteronormativity. Heteronormativity, which is a long way of saying that heterosexual orientation, man and woman getting together, and heterosexual activities are normal. We assume that that is the normal activity, and when we look at other people in our own society or people in different societies, that we don't even think that people could be doing those things. You don't even think that two guys could be buried in an embrace, or that's considered to be abnormal or out of the ordinary. Your textbook gives you this great graph where you can do a little gender sex challenge and figure out where you stand on this. I probably would do it if you can. Better do it fast before you move to a state where they won't let you do this. So, marriage. Marriage is something that is found in almost all human societies. It's pretty universal, but as in other things that we talk about, there's a lot of variation in terms of individuals and how they get married. What marriage seems to do, from an anthropological viewpoint, is, first of all, it legitimizes certain sexual relations. When you have sex within marriage, that is seen as legitimate. The offspring of the marriage then also get to be legitimate. So if you have inheritance or naming practices, when the offspring come from a marriage, it legitimizes those offspring. That means that the people that are involved in this relationship are often considered to be officially kin to each other. Somebody gets married in your family, all of a sudden there's a number of other people that you start to call brother-in-law or sister-in-law. What does that mean? We've just created a kinship relationship between people that are not necessarily biologically related. It also serves to organize economic resources. So when people get combined into a marriage relationship, they often combine their economic resources or their stuff, and then that gets passed down to people who are considered to be legitimate heirs, and that is all sanctioned by the laws. And in our country, it is easy to do this. If you are married, it is easier to get access to some of these economic resources and legitimate your access to those resources. One of the reasons why same-sex marriage was such an important thing in this country is because of our healthcare system and the fact that you could get health insurance for your spouse if you were officially married because it came through your job. In places that have universal health care where you just get health care because you're born, it is not necessarily so important to have these official marriage relationships. But in our country, if there was a huge discrimination between people who might be in same-sex relationships in terms of their access to health care and other resources like inheritance, tax paying, being able to file married, filing jointly. So we make it, we encourage people to do certain things, both legally and informally, in order to legitimate these relationships. Now, that doesn't mean people don't do other things. Obviously, they do, but those things are often considered to be illegitimate. Marriage can also be a way of forming political alliance, as the European monarchies have known for a long time. You marry your people to different kings and queens and princes and dukes and all these things in order to have a political alliance. Now we see this in the high reaches of society, but it can be done also in other political forms. So people might marry into a neighboring group, which is typically maybe at odds with each other, and it creates ties so that there might be more peaceful relationships between those groups. These people didn't always get along when they got married, by the way, but that's what World War One. Yeah, nobody can figure out World War One, but it seems to have something to do with one of these guys getting shot. Unfortunately, that's probably as good of an explanation as we're going to get for World War One. So, are a number of different marriage systems. We know monogamy, or one person being married to one person, but there are also forms of polygamy, where one person can be officially married to more than one person. The most common form of polygamy is a form known as polygyny, and that gyne is root word for woman. That's why if you were a woman, you might see a gynecologist. So polygyny, or polygyny, refers to when one man is married to more than one woman. In most societies in the world, this is a an imaginable form of marriage. So it is illegal in our own society, although in certain groups it was practiced for a time, but it is technically illegal. In many other societies, it is permitted and it may even be seen as an ideal. However, it is only the richest people, the richest men who are able to do this because you have to economically support more than one woman. It is seen as something that would be something that only the richest could do or the people who need the most labor. So it is seen as sometimes as an ideal. It can be difficult. Polyandry, which is quite rare form of marriage, at least legally. So androus, one woman being married to more than one man. In the few cases that we know, such as in highland Tibet, it is usually fraternal polyandry. Fraternal polyandry is a one woman married to more than one man, and they're usually brothers. Look how happy they all look there. In this case, the reason for fraternal polyandry seems to be that people want to keep the economic resources and inheritance in a certain family. So even in the places where it is practiced or is legal, It is not necessarily seen as an ideal form of marriage because you're trying to keep stuff in the family line. But it is practiced in certain places and it can work. Monogamy. Monogamy is the most common marriage form worldwide. Even in societies that permit polygamy, the majority of marriages are monogamous. In many Islamic societies, it is permitted to have more than one wife. However, you have to have a house for each wife. Most of us don't even have a house for one wife. So to have more than one house would mean that you would be pretty rich and able to maintain that. So it might be an ideal for some people who need more labor and more children, but it's not going to be for most people. Many societies tolerate informal polygamy. That is, a man who has a relationship with more than one woman. So might have a wife and somebody who is not officially married to him, but might be considered to be. Your textbook gives you this example of the funeral of Francois Mitterrand in France. So he was the prime minister. There he is, he's dead. I forget who this guy is. On one side was his wife, and on one side was his mistress and his daughter. So they were saying, hey, he's officially married to one person, but these other people are important. Now, in our society, we say that we do not tolerate this. However, we do something which is what many people have called serial monogamy. Not all of our marriages in the United States continue forever. You may be aware of this. We say that we are monogamous, but in practice, a lot of people go through one or two people over the course of their lifetimes, or three or four in a row. So serial monogamy. Some people believe that we learn this in college, monogamous for a while, and you go on to somebody else. Some people look at our own society and say, if you would be more tolerant of informal relationships, you wouldn't have all these marriages and divorces going on. You could just be chilled out. I'm not sure about that, but it's an interesting idea. Marriage and family can be very happy places, but as we may know, these new kinship ties can also cause tension. I mentioned brother-in-laws and sister-in-laws. In some societies, there are certain relationships in which you don't even talk to the people that you're trying to avoid them. There are special linguistic forms. In our society, some people sometimes complain, guys will complain about or guys or women will complain about their mother-in-laws. It's being too meddling. We have this phrase that a woman marries a man and a man marries a family. So this causes tension and maybe might need some avoidance speech or joking behavior. Now, you might be wondering, what about love? We've been talking about economic arrangements. We've been talking about political arrangements, different forms of laws, and what is tolerated. So I'll first start by saying that people everywhere talk about love and romantic feelings toward another person. This is not a strange thing. This has been going on for a long time. Even in societies in which they have very strictly arranged marriages, people will talk about falling in love. It may be with somebody outside of the marriage, and that may be tolerated because people are like, well, you're in an arranged marriage, so you should be able to have some romance outside of it. Or other people say that even though their marriage was arranged, that they grew to love each other, that they grew to be in love. In many societies, it would be absurd to say that you fell in love with somebody. How can you fall in love with somebody? Love at first sight. You're supposed to grow into love with that person based on your compatibility. So, in many of these societies, or throughout time, even in European societies, the idea that you would base your marriage on something as silly and fickle as romantic love would be like crazy. The thing is most people, when they say they fall in love with somebody, it's usually to get out of a relationship more than it is to get into one. They're like, oh, I was in this relationship, but then I met somebody and I fell in love, and now I have to break up with you because I'm going with this other person. Everybody knows that falling in love, boy, that comes and goes. They would say, no, you can't base your marriage on that. You can have love, that's fine, but if you want to get married to somebody, you better make sure it's the right person in terms of economics and the political alliance and their compatibility. This was true up until a couple hundred years ago in European societies. If you read those Jane Austen novels and all those things, that's the time that people talk about love as the basis for marriage. In our own society, we hardly ever see people marrying outside of their social class. Statistically speaking, 95% of marriages are between people of rich people marry rich people, and working class people marry working class people. It's very rare to see it outside of a social class. Now, around the world, everybody watches movies now and has notions of romantic love. Probably the Bollywood film industry is larger and more seen than the Hollywood film industry in terms of romance and love and interest in love. This is something that if you go to any society today, people will talk about being in love and that as being the primary basis for marriage. In recent years, there's been a slight backlash to this because people are finding out that these marriages for love might not work out as well as some of the previous arrangements in which things were fixed up by parents or friends. Some people are going back to those old ideas that instead of using dating apps, you should go meet people in places like churches and synagogues and stuff and talk to them in real life, work out your compatibility.